no one is paying attention because the banks are too busy getting paid obscene fees to sell these bonds.
But wait, you are the bank. When you work for the bank, I bet your margins are pretty nice and fat.
Let's not talk about my margins, by the way. Being nice and fat, that's a nice shirt. Do they make it for men?
Aren't you the bank?
I work for the bank. I don't think like a bank. Big bank, small bank, I like to make money.
I'm Chris Hill. This is Money Unplugged. Thanks for checking out the podcast and spreading the word. It's only been a couple of weeks, but already some of you have posted stuff on social media, written some really nice reviews on Apple and Spotify and elsewhere, and I appreciate it, so thank you for that. Today on the show, Christine Benz, Director of Personal Finance and Retirement Planning at Morningstar. She's co-host of the Longview podcast. She's a writer, a public speaker. She's been on Barron's list of the 100 most influential women in finance. And somehow, despite all that, I feel like Christine is one of those people who still kind of flies under the radar when it comes to money. When you opened your podcast app and saw the name Christine Benz, it wouldn't surprise me if some of you thought, I don't know who that is. That's okay, though. You're about to find out. I went to Chicago earlier this month, sat down with her in one of the Morningstar studios, and we had a great conversation. As you're about to hear, Christine is another one of those people whose professional life turned out to be very different than what she had planned. We talk about that. We talk about her latest book, which came out last fall. It's called How to Retire, 20 Lessons for a Happy, Successful, and Wealthy Retirement. And we get into some fun stuff, too. So let's get to it with Christine Benz. What's the first thing you remember about money?
Probably the first thing was that there was a big economic gulf in terms of my two sets of grandparents, that my mom was from a much more modest household and her mother ended up living the longest, and she had this little apartment, and you know, I would get like maybe a $5 bill in my birthday card from my grandma on my mom's side. And my dad's side, they were much more flush seeming to me. They had Cadillacs, and you know, you'd get a $100 bill in your birthday card. And back in the 70s, that was like not chump change. And
I would take a $100 bill right
today,
now.
Me too. You'd get $20 for going out if my grandpa realized that he had left the windows open in the car and he wanted you to roll them up because he thought rain was coming. You'd get $20 for that. And even in my grandparents' house, my grandmother, I think, grew up in a poor Danish household. This is the now rich grandma, but she had such a scarcity mindset. Like, you would see, she actually kept in their basement shelves of toys that she would buy for us. She would see things on sale and be like, oh, that's a good price on dolls or whatever. So you'd be able to like go there and shop the shelves of that basement. It was amazing. So kind of looking at those two experiences, I think they probably influenced my thinking about things, that having more money was fun, you know, and seeing the way that my grandparents lived seemed like more fun.
But it's interesting that even though that one grandmother was in a situation when she was your grandmother, they seemed very flush. If grandpa's tipping you $20 to go roll up the windows in the car, she still has that mindset. And that's the thing. And I mean, I've seen that over and over, and I'm guessing in your line of work, you've seen that as well, that people, the way they're ingrained when they're kids, however their financial situation changes, particularly if it improves, they never completely lose that scarcity mindset, or it's certainly rare.
I've heard that again and again. In fact, I was recently interviewing Melody Hobson for our Morningstar podcast, and she made that same point, that Melody Hobson is, entrepreneur, married to George Lucas, no financial worries in the foreseeable future.
Fine.
She's fine. But she made that point that having grown up in a household where sometimes they had to move on short notice or the lights were turned off or whatever the case was, that she still has a scarcity mindset. So the phenomenon is a real thing.
So you go to the University of Illinois. Did you have a job before that? Like when you were a teenager? What was your first job?
So I was a babysitter, like all good girls in the suburbs, a very active babysitter. And then my first real job, though, was working in a hardware store, like a local hardware store, not a big name brand hardware store. But yeah, just cashiering in that hardware store where a lot of kids in my high school worked. So it's kind of a fun experience.
That's a good first job, although I'm guessing the cashier, you're probably right up at the front, and people walk in, and you're the one getting the question, like, where do I find this? Where are the lug nuts? Where do you keep the screwdrivers?
There was that, yeah.
Did you have to memorize where everything was?
No, thankfully, that wasn't part of my job. The one thing I remember about that job, though, was that there was this whole very manual aspect to, they had these store charges. It was this small store, so people would have these store charges. And so you had to handwrite each of the things that someone was buying on this thing with like carbon copies. And so that was kind of the main thing I remember from that job. Like people would come up and say, it's a store charge. And I'd be like, oh my God.
It's a whole process now you have to deal with.
Yes.
As opposed to just making change.
Exactly. I'm still really good about making change, though. I'm still like the person who's like, gives the cashier, if my bill is $12.18, I'm giving her like $20.18, and they're looking at it like, what, what is this 18 cents? And I'm like, once a cashier, always a cashier, right? I'm still good at doing that quick math in my head.
So you go to the University of Illinois?
Yes.
You study like European studies, Russian studies?
Russian language.
Okay.
I had studied Russian actually for 6 years, and I'm dating myself because there are actually a lot of Russian majors in my general era, but I had studied Russian for 6 years leading up to high school. Leading up to college, I went to a very large high school that happened to offer Russian. And even in my junior high, I remember there was this retired Russian teacher came over to my junior high and offered to teach some of us Russian. Like, hey, if you want to get out of study hall, or I can't remember what the alternative was, I can teach some of these students Russian. So I started in 7th grade, carried on through high school. So by the time I got to college, I had 6 years of Russian under my belt. It seemed logical to keep taking Russian. And poli-sci as well was just an interest of mine, international relations.
And armed with all of that knowledge, you plan to do what when you graduate?
God only knows.
Like, are you thinking, I'm going to work overseas, I'm going to work for the CIA?
Maybe some vague do-gooder notion, but not very well conceived. I think I had been told, since I was a good writer, I had been told kind of throughout high school that I should think about a career in law. So kind of started with a pre-law mindset, but exited college with this double major and no clear sense of what I hoped to achieve, except I did have a great internship in D.C. where I worked for the European Economic Community, and that was just a wonderful life experience for me, living in a city, working at a job in an office. So I had some sense that I wanted to continue down that path, which I didn't. But
I was going to say, which you didn't. So
No.
what brings you back to Chicago? What gets you to Morningstar? And how does money factor into all of that?
So there's kind of this natural mass exodus of students from the University of Illinois back up to Chicago. So I came back to Chicago and realized that there was a lot about Chicago that I loved. My family was here. I'm still really close to my family. I had a lot of friends in the Chicago area. So I kind of decided I wanted to stay in Chicago. Certainly there weren't a lot of opportunities to put my academic background to work, so I started with a couple of positions in publishing, then ended up at Morningstar reading actually a want ad in the paper, and I remember showing it to my dad. I was like, do you know this company? And my dad was like, oh yeah, Morningstar. He really liked what Morningstar was doing. My dad was an investor, and mainly a stock investor, but eventually a mutual fund investor, and so he was like, you should definitely apply there. They seem like they're growing really quickly. So I started as a copy editor at Morningstar. editing the analyst reports, and kind of decided that I was interested in this stuff.
I saw somewhere that you said that when you got to Morningstar, and I don't know if this was just for copy editors or for everyone who started working there, you got a reading list.
Yeah.
What's on the reading list when you know your first? Today someone gets a new job at a company. There's usually like a box of swag that they get. You get homework.
Right.
What books are you being assigned?
Yeah, I will say Morningstar was such an exciting place from that standpoint that they wanted the people doing phone support and the people in HR to have some basic understanding of, like, what are we doing here? What is the point of this company? So remember, the first book on the reading list was Burton Malkiel's Random Walk Down Wall Street, which is such a beautifully written book. It's just got a lot of verve to it. I haven't revisited it since reading it in 1993, but I just remember I was like, this is really interesting stuff, talking about indexing and the whole folly of active investing. So remember, that was top of the list. Certainly some of Jack Bogle's books were top of the list. Joe Nocera's book, Piece of the Action, was there. Those were some of the first ones I remember getting through.
Somewhere in the timeline, you get married. How much did you talk about money before you got married?
Very little, except that he was more of a saver than I was. I had grown up without a lot of good financial education. I would just say that my parents they were of an era where it wasn't polite to talk about money, but we just didn't. And I will say, from the standpoint of like household finances, they were incredibly tranquil about money. I think they were in a good position financially, and so I just never remember any discussion. So I was not especially adept with my money, and my husband was just much better, was much more naturally a saver. He had put himself through school, basically, had always worked, and he had a savings mindset, not an overly thrifty way, just really well balanced. And so I'm always a person who thinks about, like, when you talk about couples and money, I am here to say couples can rise to the better partners' habits. Like, there doesn't have to be this spendthrift saver conflict that goes on forever and ever. So he was just like into saving, and he wanted us to buy a house. I wanted us to buy a house too. And so we both kind of put ourselves into that, and I would say that was kind of our main kind of first discussion about money. Like, how are we going to do that? How much are we going to save? And it was so valuable to do that with him fairly early in our marriage, because then I was like, the light bulb went off. Like, oh, now I get it. Now I get why we can't go out to dinner 3 nights a week or do whatever, because of this. And this is fantastic. And I always think, like, when we talk to people about improving their financial habits, we can help them set themselves up with smaller wins earlier versus like this thing way into the future. That's the way to think about it and try to help people.
As someone who also grew up in the 70s and is the youngest of multiple children, I don't think you're alone in terms of, we didn't really talk about money in the house. I think it's easier now, in part because of social media and the access that kids have to information. But in the 70s, it was, and it was sort of it had to do with politeness.
Yes.
It's like, no, that's gauche. Don't talk about money.
Yeah.
It seems like a lot of information around money is tied to a number, how to make your first million, that sort of thing. And in reading your stuff, I really like and find myself gravitating towards, you don't really put a number out there as a goal. You put peace of mind as the goal. Did it take you a while to get to that? Or is that something you just, like, you figured out pretty early, like, oh no, there's not a number I need. Like, yes, you need to get to a number to buy a particular house, but in terms of like larger financial goals, just being able to sleep at night seems like the best aspiration.
It is. And that, when I get feedback from our readers, that is the main thing that I love to see. People say, oh, you talk about the bucket approach and it gives me peace of mind. And I love to see that. In terms of my own evolution, to realize that I wrote this piece about luxury goods, and I think peace of mind is the ultimate luxury good. I think it was more or less a slow evolution, just, the sense that almost anything can happen. Not anything, but a lot of things could happen, and we could be resilient in its face. Things big and small could happen financially, and we would be able to weather that storm. And I do see that as such a key luxury good, being able to help people I love who might have financial needs. It's kind of a relative of that, where I'm not worrying about them. I'm able to help them. It's everything, and has become a much more important kind of luxury good for me than stuff. It's something that I care more about.
More with Christine in a minute, but first, let me tell you how I upped my game when it comes to grilling and cooking. It's pretty simple. I started using Dizzy Pig seasonings. Whether you're grilling up chicken, beef, pork, seafood, or vegetables, Dizzy Pig has got the rubs and spices to impress your guests and make your taste buds happy. You can go savory with a little bit of sweet. You can go with as much heat as you want. Personally, if I'm grilling meat, I'll throw on some of their Crossroads Southern Barbecue. If I'm doing fish, I'll toss on their spicy pineapple head mix. And Dizzy Pig is a small family-owned company. Why does that matter? Because they actually grind whole spices just before bottling. These are true craft products, and they are made in small batches and bottled by hand. There's so many great flavors, and you can get whatever you want, but if you want my 2 cents, think about getting their sampler pack so you can test out 5 different flavors. Just go to dizzypigbbq.com, use the promo code MONEY, and get 10% off your first purchase. Just click the link in the show notes or go to dizzypigbbq.com. Get 10% off by using the promo code MONEY. All right, let's get back to Christine. There are some people who write a book because they just want to write a book. You've written books before. What was it about this topic that made you say, I'm going to spend the time to put together this book?
So I've been toiling on retirement decumulation for the past decade or so, probably more.
Decumulation?
Decumulation versus accumulation.
There we go.
How do you spend what you've managed to save? How do you do this retirement process? How do you construct your portfolio to support your cash flows? How do you set up your non-portfolio income sources to provide additional spending? All that stuff. There's so much there. And so, just from a selfish standpoint, it's just a super interesting area to research. There's, I think, a huge behavioral aspect to it that people really struggle to spend down what they've managed to save. And, it almost seems perverse to talk about it in our culture where we have so many people who are quite undersaved relative to what they need for retirement. But over here, we've got a lot of people who have way more than they'll ever need in a lifetime. How do we help them spend appropriately, give appropriately, all that stuff? So I had just been working on that area and had met a lot of great people in that general space, people who work on non-financial and financial aspects of retirement. And it was really my editor at Harriman House who had the idea of constructing this book as a series of interviews. And I love the way it came together, that it does harness the expertise of all of these people. And I also love that my imposter syndrome didn't come up because, I wasn't having to be like, oh, I know all there is to know about healthcare or housing and retirement or topics where I know like a little bit about. It was really nice to be able to turn to people who actually know a lot about that stuff.
Yeah, you have that great line in the book. If people think that retirement planning is confusing and chaotic, it's because it actually is.
Right.
And it's such a huge world. And it is one of the things I really like about the book, as you indicated, about half of it has to do with money. The other half is really about how are you spending your time? How are you living? What kind of habits do you have? That sort of thing. The thing that I'm sure most people don't really think about. I know I didn't think about it until very recently.
Yeah, I think people tend to either be overly focused on the financial, which I certainly was as I was working on the whole issue of how do you construct retirement portfolios and on down the line. So you either focus exclusively on the financials or you focus on the non-financial and you don't think enough about the financial. And so I like that the book is a marriage of those two things because you need to be thinking about both sets of considerations.
Were there any conversations you had with the people you were interviewing where something surprised you?
Well, one theme I would say runs through the book, which is that we actually derive a lot from our jobs, probably a lot more than we give them credit for. And even for people who don't love the substance of their jobs like I do, probably still have some meaningful relationships in that job. For a lot of us, it's a sense of purpose and identity. And so I would say that the consistency with which various experts touched that topic probably surprised me most of all. And then another kind of smaller bore aha moment that I've called out a couple times relates to John Guyton, who's a financial planner and also a researcher in the realm of retirement spending. He is a big believer in people being flexible in terms of determining how much they can spend from their portfolio, that ideally you're kind of plugging into what's going on in your portfolio and in the market and using that to inform how much you take out on a year-by-year basis. And he made the great point that that's a rare thing that is good for your portfolio. Like if you can take less when your portfolio's down, that is good for the long-term health of your portfolio. It's probably also what you feel like doing. You probably feel a little poorer and spending less when your portfolio's down. And when it's up, you feel like spending a little bit more. I thought that was kind of a neat way to think about the virtue of being flexible with retirement spending.
If you get to wave a magic wand in terms of younger people, what do you think helps, whether it's classes in school, in high school, in college, what helps younger people get up to speed on money in general? Because it's this thing that we all need, it's this thing that we all depend on, and it doesn't come with operating instructions.
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously the importance of having a reasonable lifestyle that in turn can help you come up with a decent savings rate. So that's a huge thing. But one thing I just am a huge evangelist for is the idea of simplicity, that the financial services industry so sells the message that this is all hopelessly complicated, especially the investment portfolio management. And it's so self-serving. It's like, you need us, you will always need us because you can't figure this out yourself. So I guess the key message that I would like to impart to young people is it can really be quite simple. And so I'm so happy to hear I've even seen the sweatshirts, the VTSAX and Chill sweatshirts, just buy the market and don't worry about all this gobbledygook. Unfortunately, it's not an easy lesson to sell, but that's probably the main lesson that I like to impart about the investing piece.
Yeah, I don't think you're getting 1 million hits on TikTok if you're pushing by the total market index.
Right. But it's amazing to me. I love the FIRE community for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that mainly they are very vanilla in terms of their investment approach. They're probably a little more into rental properties than I would be inclined to recommend for most people, but I love that in terms of the investment portfolio, they're pretty index-centric, which I think is a positive.
All right, let's go to the speed round. What is something you have bought that makes you happy?
A really long-term expenditure is the house that we live in. So we live in this prairie house that was designed by someone who worked for Frank Lloyd Wright. And so it's just got beautiful bones. I remember we walked in to look at the house in 2006, and it was just like I was outside. It was a day in January, but it was so bright and beautiful inside, and nature all around. And I remember I was talking to my sister. I was like, we've just looked at this one house. And she's like, I think you need to see more houses. I'm like, but I don't want to see any more houses. And so that, even though it's really been one of those proverbial money pits, like we've had to make a lot of expensive renovations, that has been a great ROI, not just in terms of like living in a beautiful place, but also amazing friends and neighbors in our community. So that is a big ticket item that has really paid for itself many times over.
I remember the house I live in following the home inspector around when he's going through the whole thing. Followed him for hours. He very nicely indulged all of my questions because it was my first house. And at the end, I said, do you have any advice for a first-time home buyer? And I will always remember he said, it never stops. And I said, what never stops? He said, when you own a home, it never stops. Either something breaks and you got to fix it, or you get bored with something and you want to change it. It never stops.
Such a good piece of advice, right? It's kind of true, especially in the realm of old houses. I think we're probably done with old houses. My husband's like, I don't have it in me. But anyway, it's been a great journey.
Have you ever made a purchase in your life at any point that you regret and you still think about it?
Well, one, and this is total recency bias, our stove, so we had this really nice commercial gas stove, broke down right before the holidays. So we're researching like, gas stoves don't seem like the future. And we care about the environment. We're like, we should get some sort of induction stove. So I guess we're still in the learning curve. We got a lovely Wolf induction stove, but I'm still like figuring out how to use it. And especially like everyone was like, oh, they look so great when they're clean, which they do. But when it's
everything
kind of
looks great when it's
well,
clean.
True. And so I'm telling my husband that he's gifted at cleaning that stove. But when it has been used recently, it looks really bad. So, that's one thing that I've been kind of like, did we do the right thing? I still think we probably did, but I've been feeling a little bit of regret about that one.
What's the last thing you splurged on just for yourself?
So do I get experiences? Can that count?
Sure.
Okay. So my thing is I love live music. My husband we love music. So we do not buy tickets like when they first become available because we're never sure like what we'll be doing, how we'll feel. Like I've had so many experiences where I've been like, what was I thinking? It's Sunday night. I don't feel like going out. So I buy tickets on, the resellers mostly because I buy them fairly close to the event when I know that we will feel like going. So a good recent example is there was a Jeff Tweedy show at Unity Temple in Oak Park. This has been a little while now, but my two best college friends both live in California, and they were coming for a visit, and so I bought us all tickets fairly close to the event. My husband was like yelling, buy, 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 because I was like vacillating on how much they were. So worth it. Such an amazing splurge.
What is something you wish you knew earlier about money?
Just how simple it can be. I think that is a key lesson. I was listening to Michael Lewis talk about this. Like, his regret is that he wished he had pushed harder on things at various points in his career, various financial inventions, innovations. And I wish I had just woken up to that earlier, that I think I approached investing with too much credulity, that I didn't push back enough. I didn't ask enough questions about, well, wait, how does this work? So that's probably a lesson that I wish I had gotten earlier.
What is a charitable cause that you like to support?
Well, one big one is I have a sister with an intellectual disability, so I love charities that support people with special needs. And it tends to be really decentralized. I can't point people to a big national one, but I would say just, within your community, you've probably got some great organizations that are geared toward providing services to people with special needs.
Do you have a favorite movie, television show, fictional character that has money as a central through line?
One is Moneyball, the Michael Lewis book, then movie. I'm a huge baseball fan, so I loved that aspect of it, certainly, but it's also just such an entertaining tale of investing. It's actually kind of, I think, an indictment of active investing and the kind of quirkiness of active investing. So just a super fun, entertaining, educational movie that comes to mind.
Are you a Cubs fan or a White Sox fan?
Cubs. Long-suffering Cubs, although 2016 was an amazing year.
We'll wrap up with what I like to call a penny for your thoughts. And it doesn't have to be about money. It can just be any type of life lesson or wisdom that you've learned along the way that you could share with people who are listening.
One thing I wrote in the book was about what I call micro joys that I feel lucky. I feel like I've had a big life in a lot of ways and had a lot of great opportunities. But when I think about my favorite things, they're really small. Like just, having dinner with my husband on our patio or taking a walk with my walking partner to get coffee or whatever. And the nice thing about those small joys is just that we can all pursue them every day. And they're all different for us, but, just figure out what yours are and then make sure that you have them every day. And I love that it is, something that people of all economic means can pursue. Whatever their micro joys are, go for that and make sure that you're doing some of them every day if you can.
There you go. Christine's book, How to Retire, is available everywhere. And it's one of those books that ended up on a bunch of year-end lists for best books of 2024. So pick up a copy for yourself or maybe someone you know who could use a little help with planning for retirement. If you want to contact this show, drop a note to info@moneyunpluggedpod.com. I'm Chris Hill. Thanks for listening. See you next week.